I'd spent 3 years on the water, working my way up to crew foreman on boats running out of St. Paul Harbor. 3 years of 16-hour shifts in the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea, saving every spare dollar I could scrape together. The plan was simple. Put down enough for my own boat, work it myself, stop making someone else rich. Then I caught my knee wrong on a wet deck 6 weeks before closing, and the whole thing came apart. The surgery took everything I'd saved. The recovery took longer than the surgeon said it would. The knee still wasn't right. It held my weight, but it didn't hold it the way it used to. I could walk fine. I could work. I just couldn't work the deck anymore. And the boats weren't hiring crew foremen who couldn't move fast when the weather turned. Rent was 2 weeks late when I found the posting. I was on a maritime jobs board late at night, the kind of site where most of the listings were weeks old and half of them were scams. I didn't remember seeing the post the day before, but it was sitting at the top of the page when I refreshed. Site maintenance worker, deep water processing station, Unalaska Island. Remote housing included. Pay above market. I applied the same night. They hired me in 48 hours. Start date, flight into Dutch Harbor, company truck waiting at the airport. The email came with a phone number I didn't call and directions I didn't question. I texted my sister Sierra to let her know I'd gotten work and would be out of contact for stretches. She wrote back, "What kind of place?" I told her it was a fish processing station. She didn't ask more. The flight to Dutch Harbor left early and landed in fog. I picked up the truck from the airport lot, keys in the ignition, my name on a card tucked under the visor, and followed the coastal access road east toward Vanthorpe Station. The directions said 8 minutes. I didn't stop, didn't take a wrong turn, kept the speedometer steady. When I pulled into the gravel lot, my phone GPS said I'd arrived 4 minutes late. My watch said I was 4 minutes early. I looked at both, then at the road behind me. Straight shot, no detours. I filed it and kept moving. Vanthorpe Station sat low against the gravel shelf, a concrete processing building with narrow windows and a flat roof. The beach below was black rock, the kind that stays slick even when it's dry. Offshore, the dredging rigs were just shapes in the Aleutian fog, gray on gray. The whole place had the feel of something that had been here longer than it looked. There was one other vehicle in the lot, a dark green Ford F-250 parked near the building, frost thick on the windshield. No tire tracks around it, no footprints. It looked like it had been sitting there for days, maybe longer. I stepped out of the company truck and walked toward the entrance. The equipment cage smelled like machine oil and salt. Doris was already waiting when I came through the door, standing by a rack of tool belts with her second cup of coffee in one hand. The coffee looked cold. She was compact and deliberate in the way people get when they've spent years doing the same work in the same place, and when she spoke it was mid-thought, like I'd missed the first half of the sentence. "Melvin's over there," she said, nodding toward a workbench near the back wall. "He runs the dock. Kenneth's on nights. He's sleeping." Melvin was cataloging equipment with his left hand while eating crackers from a bag with his right, looking at neither task. He glanced up when Doris said his name, nodded once, and went back to what he was doing. Doris took a sip of her coffee and made a face like she'd forgotten it was cold. "The last maintenance worker left 2 weeks ago," she said. "Declan Figg. He packed his bunk but left his truck in the lot, the green Ford outside. We're still waiting on retrieval for that." She said it the way someone mentions a delayed equipment order, no weight to it. I thought about the frost on the windshield, the lack of tracks, and didn't ask. "Come on," she said. "I'll show you the office." The maintenance office was a narrow room off the main corridor with a steel desk, a filing cabinet, and a single window that looked out at the gravel lot. On the desk was a 3-ring binder, the kind with the clear plastic sleeve on the front. The sleeve held a printed label that read, "Holding Unit Protocol Log" in block letters. Doris set her coffee down and opened the binder. "This gets updated every morning. she said. 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. You check the units, you log the status, and if anything's off, you radio me. Don't improvise, don't skip a check, and don't use the phone. The pages inside were printed forms with spaces for date, time, unit number, and temperature. Most of the lines were filled in with the same tight, regular handwriting. "Declan's?" I asked. "Declan's," she said. She closed the binder and left it on the desk. "I'll walk you through the floor," she said. The processing floor was what I expected. Conveyor systems running the length of the room, sorting tables with drains, a walk-in freezer locker at the far end, exposed conduit snaking across the ceiling. It was clean in the way industrial spaces get clean, everything hosed down and left to dry. The smell was cold brine and refrigerant, and underneath both of them something else, sharp and metallic, like iron and iodine mixed together. I'd smelled it before, in the bilge of boats working the deep trench systems off Kodiak. Water that came up from places it wasn't supposed to. Doris walked ahead without looking back, moving through the space like she'd memorized the layout years ago. At the back of the floor was a steel door with a keypad lock and a second lock below it that took a physical key. "This is the holding section," she said. She punched in the code, turned the key, and pushed the door open. The room on the other side was small and cold, lit by a single overhead fluorescent that buzzed when it warmed up. Against the far wall were 6 tanks, each about the size of a chest freezer, each with a locked lid and a temperature gauge mounted on the front. Below each gauge was a metal bracket holding a paper card. Tanks 1 through 4 had cards filled out in that same tight hand. Tanks 5 and 6 were blank. Doris walked to tank 1 and tapped the gauge with one finger. "You check these twice a day," she said. "Morning and evening. You write the reading on the card. If any temperature goes more than 2 degrees above baseline, you call me on the station radio. Not the phone. Radio." I looked at the gauge on tank 5. It was reading 2 degrees above baseline right then. "Like that one?" I asked. She looked at it, pulled the radio from her belt, and keyed the mic. "Hampton to base. Tank 5 elevated 2 degrees. Logging now." She waited. The radio stayed quiet. After 10 seconds, she clipped it back to her belt, pulled a pen from her pocket, and wrote "normalized" on tank 5's card even though the gauge hadn't moved. "What's in the tanks?" I asked. "Deep material," she said. She locked the door behind us and handed me the key. That afternoon, Melvin took me out to the dock. The hydraulic lift was already running, the winch bringing up catch bins from the water one at a time. Melvin stood at the edge of the dock with a clipboard, calling weights and species as the bins came up. Pollock, 40 pounds, halibut, 62, crab, 26. He worked fast, sorting through each bin with a gaff, pushing the catch into separate containers without looking up. I stood back and watched. The air off the water was colder than it had been on the gravel shelf, and the smell of brine was stronger here. Melvin stopped at one bin and went still. "Huh," he said. I walked over. In the corner of the bin was something that wasn't fish. It was pale, almost translucent, with a flat circular body about the size of a large dog and long, thin extensions that could have been limbs. It wasn't moving. Melvin pulled his radio. "Melvin to Hampton, Doc, you need to see this." Doris arrived 3 minutes later. She looked at the thing in the bin without changing her expression, then pulled a boat hook from the rack on the dock wall and used it to roll the specimen into a separate sealed container. She was careful not to touch it. "Surface specimen," she said. "Deep organism. Comes up in the dredge catch sometimes. We hold them until the collection team retrieves them. Research office in Dutch Harbor. I've never met them." She looked at me. "Help me move this," she said. She handed me a pair of thick rubber gloves and took one end of the container. I took the other. Melvin stayed where he was. We carried it back across the dock and through the processing floor to the holding section. Doris unlocked the door and we set the container down in front of Tank 6. "This one goes here," she said. We lifted the container. The thing inside shifted slightly, the way something underwater shifts when the current changes. I kept my grip and didn't look at it. We tilted the container and the specimen slid into Tank 6. The water rippled once and went still. Then the specimen moved. It was a slow lateral flex, like something drawing a single breath, and then it stopped. Doris's expression didn't change. She locked the lid and wrote the time on Tank 6's card. Melvin, who had followed us in, set down his end of the container for a moment before picking it back up again. "That's it," Doris said. "You're logged in." She locked the holding section door and walked back to the processing floor without saying anything else. I spent the rest of the day running maintenance checks on the conveyor systems and the freezer locker. I didn't go back to the holding section. The company housing unit was a prefab building a mile down the coastal road, set back from the beach on a concrete pad. It had 4 bunk rooms, a shared kitchen, and a bathroom with a shower that took 3 minutes to warm up. My room was the second from the left. The bunk was narrow and the mattress was thin, but it was clean. I sat on the edge of the bunk and pulled out my phone. Signal was low, but still there. I sent Sierra a message. "Work is fine. Place is remote. Signal will be spotty." She replied a minute later with a photo. Her dog, a black lab mix named Charlie, lying on the couch with his head on a pillow. I set the phone down on the bunk, the photo still on the screen, and looked at the ceiling. The second morning drive to the station took 38 minutes. I didn't stop. The road was straight, and I didn't take a wrong turn. I arrived and checked my watch against the station clock, and they matched, but 38 minutes had passed on a road that took 8. I parked next to Declan's truck and went inside. The holding section door required the separate key Doris had given me. I unlocked it and stepped through, pulling the door shut behind me. 6 a.m. protocol meant temperature checks and visual confirmation of status. Tanks 1 through 4 read normal. I logged them on their cards with the pen clipped to the protocol binder I'd brought with me. Tank 5 read 1 degree above baseline. I wrote it down. Tank 6, yesterday's specimen, read normal on the gauge. Protocol said to visually confirm, so I lifted the lid. The tank was empty. I set the lid back down and checked the lock on the holding section door. Locked from the inside with my own key, the one I'd had since yesterday. No damage to the door. No damage to the tank. I pulled the radio from my belt and pressed the transmit button. "Doris, it's Dylan, holding section. Tank 6 is empty." Static, then her voice. "I'm coming." She arrived 4 minutes later. I was standing in front of Tank 6 with the protocol binder under one arm. She didn't ask me to repeat myself. She went straight to the tank, lifted the lid, looked inside, and set it back down. Then she checked the other 5 tanks, opening each one and looking in before moving to the next. When she got to Tank 2, she stopped. The log card for Tank 2 showed a small, slow-moving organism, admitted 3 weeks ago in Declan's handwriting. The last entry on the card was dated today, also in Declan's handwriting. Declan had left the island 2 weeks ago. Doris didn't move for a long time. She stood with the log card in her hand, reading it, her face completely still. Then she opened Tank 2. Empty. She turned to me. "Stay on the processing floor," she said. "Don't go down to the beach." She left through the holding section door without locking it behind her. I heard her footsteps crossing the processing floor, then the sound of the exterior door opening and closing. I stayed where I was. Both tanks locked, both empty. No sign of forced entry. 2 specimens unaccounted for. I clipped the pen back onto the protocol binder and left the holding section, locking the door behind me. 10 minutes later, Doris came back through the exterior door carrying a small spiral notebook. It was the size of a field journal, the kind with the wire binding at the top. She walked past me without speaking and went to the maintenance office. I followed her as far as the doorway. She stood at the desk and opened the notebook, reading 2 pages in silence. The light from the desk lamp caught the edge of the paper, and I could see handwriting. Tight, regular lines running margin to margin. She closed the notebook, unlocked the maintenance office safe with a key from her pocket, and put the notebook inside. Then she locked the safe and turned to face me. I didn't ask what she'd read. She didn't offer it. 2 days passed without incident. I ran the 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. checks, logged temperatures, and kept the log cards current. Tank 5 fluctuated 1 degree above baseline on the morning of the 3rd day, then returned to normal by evening. I logged both. On the 4th day, it happened again. 1 degree above baseline at 6 a.m., normal by 6 p.m. I sat at the maintenance office desk with the protocol binder open in front of me and wrote the second baseline entry on Tank 5's card. The handwriting looked like mine, but I had to think about forming each letter, as though I was learning to write again. I clipped the pen back onto the binder. The maintenance office was quiet around me. The desk lamp made a low electrical hum. Outside the small window above the desk, the fog had come in again, and the light was fading. I didn't ask Doris what she'd read in Declan's notebook, and she didn't offer it. On the 4th day, Doris was called to the dock for a supply delivery. She found me in the maintenance office going through the protocol binder, checking my entries from the previous 3 days. Each one was in my handwriting. Each one looked right. But I kept reading them over like I was trying to convince myself I'd actually written them. "I need to handle the crane offload," she said from the doorway. "You're on holding section watch until I'm back." I looked up from the binder. "How long will that take?" 20 minutes. Maybe 30 if the crane's acting up again." She leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. "Same protocol as always. If anything reads 2 degrees above baseline, radio immediately. Do not open the tank." I nodded. She stayed in the doorway for another few seconds, watching me, then turned and left. I heard her boots on the concrete floor of the processing section, then the heavy exterior door opening and closing. I sat there for a minute with the binder open in front of me. The desk lamp hummed. Outside the small window above the desk, the fog was starting to come in again, turning the gravel lot into a gray smudge. I got up and walked to the holding section. The steel door was already unlocked. I'd done the morning check 2 hours ago and hadn't bothered locking it behind me. The 6 tanks sat in their usual configuration, 3 on each side of the narrow room, each with its gauge and log card bracket. The temperature readings were all normal. Tanks 1 through 4 showed baseline. Tank 5 was 1 degree above, same as it had been for the past 2 days. Tank 6 was empty, same as it had been since the morning I found it that way. I stood there looking at the gauges and didn't move. The buzzer went off 11 minutes later. It was a loud, flat warehouse alarm mounted on the wall above Tank 3, the kind of sound that makes you want to cover your ears, but you don't because your hands are already reaching for the radio on your belt. I keyed the transmit button. "Doris, Tank 3 alarm. You copy?" Static. I waited 5 seconds and tried again. "Doris, Tank 3 temperature alarm, do you copy?" Nothing. I switched channels and called Melvin. His voice came back clipped and tight. "Yeah. Tank 3 alarm just went off. Is Doris with you?" "She's on the crane. We got a problem with the winch. She's occupied." The buzzer kept going. I looked at the gauge on Tank 3. 4 degrees above baseline. I took 2 steps closer and looked at the log card in its bracket. The handwriting was Declan's, that tight, regular script I'd seen on the first 4 cards when I started. The specimen had been admitted 7 weeks ago. The description read, "Cecil, non-reactive." I looked at the gauge again. 4 degrees above baseline. 18 minutes ago, during my last check, it had read 0. The lid of Tank 3 was slightly ajar. Not open. just not fully seated. There was maybe half an inch of clearance at the front edge, where the lid met the rim of the tank. I hadn't noticed it during the morning check, or maybe it hadn't been there during the morning check. I stared at that gap for a long time. The protocol said, "Do not open the tank." I wasn't opening it, but I also wasn't letting it open itself. I put both hands on the lid and pressed down. The metal was cold and wet under my palms. I pushed until the lid seated fully against the rim. Then I kept pushing, keeping steady pressure on it. The buzzer kept going. I lowered myself to the floor, still holding the lid, and sat with my back against the front of the tank. My hands stayed flat on the lid. The concrete was cold through my jeans, and the tank was cold against my spine, and the buzzer was loud enough that I stopped hearing it after the first minute. Something inside the tank shifted its weight. I felt it through the metal, a slow lateral movement, like a dog turning over in its sleep. Then it went still. I didn't move. The minutes stretched out. I kept my hands on the lid and my back against the tank, and I didn't move. My shoulders started to ache, then my lower back, then my thighs. I adjusted my grip on the lid once, spreading my fingers wider and kept the pressure steady. The specimen shifted again. This time it was closer to the lid. I felt the weight of it pressing up against the underside of the metal, testing it. Not hard, just a gentle exploratory pressure, the way you'd test a door to see if it was locked. I pressed down harder. The pressure from inside the tank stopped. The specimen went still again. I counted the seconds in my head, the way I used to count them on the deck of the boat when we were hauling line and the weather was turning and you needed to know how much time you had before the next swell hit. I got to 60 and started over. I got to 60 again. I kept counting. The buzzer ran the entire time. At some point, the temperature gauge started to drop. I didn't look at it. I kept my hands on the lid and my back against the tank, and I kept counting. When the door to the holding section opened, I had counted to 60 22 times. Doris came in and stopped just inside the doorway. She looked at me, then at the tank, then at the gauge. The buzzer was still going. She crossed the room and switched it off. The silence was immediate and total. "How long have you been holding it?" she asked. 22 minutes. She looked at the gauge. It was back to baseline now, maybe half a degree below. She put one hand on the lid next to mine and nodded. I took my hands off and stood up. My legs felt loose and weak, and I had to put a hand on the wall to steady myself. Doris unlocked the lid and lifted it. The specimen was there, sitting at the bottom of the tank in about 2 feet of cold seawater. It was pale and flat, roughly circular, maybe the size of a dinner plate. It looked exactly the way the log card had described it. Sessile, non-reactive. It didn't move when the light hit it. Doris leaned over the tank, looking at the underside of the lid. She went very still. I moved closer and looked where she was looking. There were marks on the inside of the lid. Thin, parallel striations, maybe a dozen of them, running in neat rows across the metal. They looked fresh. They hadn't been there the last time I'd seen the inside of that lid, 2 days ago when Doris had opened it to check the specimen after the first temperature spike. Doris pulled out her phone and took a picture of the marks. The camera shutter sound was the only noise in the holding section. 2 days later, Melvin's voice crackled over the radio before the lift was even fully up. "We got 3, he said. 3 in one load." Doris was already moving toward the door before I could ask what that meant. I followed her down to the dock. The hydraulic lift was still settling when we arrived. Melvin stood at the edge of the platform, hands at his sides, not moving. The catch bins were visible now, and I could see what he meant. 3 separate bins. 3 shapes that weren't fish. Doris approached the first bin. The specimen inside was small, maybe the size of a dinner plate, translucent enough that I could see the metal bottom of the container through it. It didn't move when Doris leaned over to look at it. "Tank 1, she said. We moved it together, the same way we'd done with the others. Thick rubber gloves, sealed transport container, the walk through the processing floor to the holding section. The specimen stayed motionless the entire time. When we lowered it into the water in Tank 1, it sank about halfway down, then drifted to the side until it pressed against the tank wall. It stayed there, oriented toward the room, flat against the glass like something watching. Melvin had followed us in. He stood in the doorway, looking at the specimen through the glass. "Looks like it's reading the room," he said. He didn't say anything else. We went back to the dock. The second specimen was larger, dark-colored, with a body that had more structure to it than the translucent one. There were bilateral formations along what I assumed was the front edge, smooth and slightly raised, arranged in pairs. "Sensory organs," Doris said, looking at them. "Don't get too close." I helped her lift the transport container. The specimen shifted inside as we moved it, and the formations along its edge angled toward me. I took a step to the left to adjust my grip. The formations followed. I moved again. They tracked me, holding orientation no matter where I stood. "Tank 4, Doris said. We logged it in. The specimen went into the water without resistance, but the sensory structures stayed oriented toward the tank lid even after we closed it. The third bin was still on the dock when we got back. Melvin was standing about 10 feet away from it, his radio in his hand. He hadn't tried to move it. I understood why when I got close enough to see inside. The specimen had arrived in pieces, separate sections, each one moving on its own, but slowly drawing together. The extensions weren't limbs exactly, but they functioned like them, reaching and pulling, bringing the fragments into contact with each other. One of the extensions had wrapped around the handle of the boat hook Melvin had tried to use. It wasn't pulling. It was just holding. Melvin keyed the radio. "Doris," he said, "you need to come to the dock." She was already there. She stepped past me and looked into the bin for a long time without speaking. "This one can't go in a tank," she said finally. "We have no protocol for a specimen this size." She pulled out her phone and took several pictures of it, then turned and walked back toward the building without another word. The specimen stopped reassembling. I stayed where I was, watching it. The extensions didn't move. The one wrapped around the boat hook handle stayed exactly where it was, neither tightening nor releasing. It was waiting. I don't know how I knew that, but I did. Doris came back 5 minutes later. She was carrying the protocol binder under one arm and Declan's notebook in her other hand. "The Dutch harbor line is disconnected," she said. "Not busy. Disconnected." She opened Declan's notebook to the last page with writing on it and read aloud. "Dutch harbor hasn't picked up in 6 weeks. I think the collection team stopped coming. I think the tanks are the collection." She closed the notebook. "Leave it where it is," she said. "Both of you, go back inside." The specimen stayed in the staging area, in the catch bin, with the boat hook still in its grip. That night, the satellite dish lost signal. I was in my bunk at the housing unit when I realized it. I'd been trying to send a text to Sierra for the last 20 minutes. The message wouldn't go through. Neither had the previous 3 I'd sent that afternoon. I checked the dish status on my phone. The internet connection was fine. The phone relay was down. I heard footsteps in the hall outside my room, then the sound of the kitchen faucet running. Kenneth was at the sink when I walked in. He filled a glass with water, turned off the tap, and sat down at the table. "The signal drops when the water is doing something," he said. He drank half the glass and set it down. "I've been night watch here for 2 years," he said. "There have been 4 maintenance workers in that time. All 4 of them left. Only 2 of them were still normal when they went. The other 2 started keeping their own logs." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it on the table and slid it toward me. It was a page torn from a spiral notebook, covered in tight handwriting that wasn't Declan's. The lines were compressed, the margins filled with notes that bled into each other. I started reading. The notebook documented a theory. The specimens in the tanks weren't being held for collection. They were being sorted. Something in the water was using the station to identify which organisms could acclimate to surface conditions and which couldn't. The ones that acclimated were allowed to leave the tanks. The ones that didn't were retrieved. The tanks that had emptied, Tank 6 and Tank 2, had held the specimens that passed. The tanks weren't storage. They were a filter. I said this aloud, more to myself than to Kenneth. "Whatever is tracking which ones make it," Kenneth said. "It knows how many tanks you have." The radio on the counter crackled once, then went silent. A moment later, the temperature alarm started. Not one tank, 3 of them, all at once, the overlapping tones blending into a single sustained noise that transmitted through the relay and filled the kitchen. Tanks 1, 3, and 4. Kenneth stood and walked to the radio. He didn't turn it off. He just looked at it. I went back to my room. The alarm kept going. I could hear it through the walls, through the floor. A steady mechanical wail that didn't change in pitch or volume. I sat on my bunk with my back against the wall. The alarm went on for 43 minutes. Then the radio relay went quiet. The signal cut out. The alarm stopped. I didn't move. I woke on the processing floor at first light, the concrete cold against my back, my radio still in my hand. I didn't remember lying down. The station was quiet. I got up and walked through the equipment cage toward the front entrance. Doris's car sat in the gravel lot outside, frost on the windshield. The green F-250 next to it looked the same as it had yesterday. Inside, the break room was empty. No coffee made. The pot sat cold on the burner. I found her radio on the floor near the conveyor line. The battery was dead. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. The casing was warm, like it had been running until recently. I set it on the sorting table and walked to the dock entrance. Melvin was outside, standing at the far end of the concrete platform where the hydraulic lift came up from the water. His back was to me. His hands hung at his sides. He wasn't sorting catch. There was no catch bin on the lift. I called his name. He didn't turn. I walked closer, my boots loud on the concrete. The fog was coming in off the water, thick enough that the dredging rigs were gone. I could see maybe 20 feet before everything turned gray. Melvin. He didn't move. His head was angled down, looking at the water. I got close enough to see his profile. His eyes were open. His mouth was slightly open. He looked like he was listening to something. I touched his shoulder. He didn't react. I stepped back and looked at the water below the dock. The surface was flat, dark, no movement. The iron and iodine smell was stronger than usual, thick enough to taste. I left him there and went back inside. The holding section door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the narrow room with the 6 tanks lined against the wall. Tanks 1, 3, and 4 had their lids open. The temperature gauges read ambient. I walked to tank 1 and looked inside. Empty. The water was still, clear all the way to the bottom. I checked tank 3. Empty. Tank 4. Empty. All 3 tanks that had alarmed last night were open and drained. Tank 2 was closed, the lid locked, the gauge reading normal. I checked the log card. Doris's handwriting from yesterday showed the specimen readmitted after its return. The entry was dated and signed. I moved to tank 5. The gauge read 2 degrees above baseline. The log card showed entries I didn't recognize. The handwriting was tight and regular, the dates recent, the notations brief. I didn't know who had written them. The entries went back 6 days. Tank 6 was the same. Occupied. Log card filled in a hand I had never seen before. I stood between the 2 tanks and tried to remember if I had opened them, if I had logged them, if I had seen Doris open them. Nothing came. The temperature gauge on tank 5 ticked upward, 3 degrees above baseline. I stepped closer to the tank. The lid was locked. I put my hand on the metal surface. It was warm. The gauge climbed, 4 degrees above baseline. Something moved inside the water. I heard it shift, a slow dragging sound against the tank wall. I took my hand off the lid and backed toward the door. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on tank 5 until I was in the corridor. Kenneth was standing 10 feet away, his back to me, Declan's notebook open in his hands. He was reading aloud in a flat, steady voice. No inflection, no pauses between sentences. Dutch Harbor hasn't picked up in 6 weeks. I think the collection team stopped coming. I think the tanks are the collection. He turned the page. Tank 2 reoccupied. Same specimen. Logged return at 0430. No damage to lid or lock. I think it knows the layout now. I said his name. He didn't stop reading. Satellite relay down. Radio relay functional, but no response from Harbor. Carla not answering. Melvin not answering. I think the sorting is done. I stepped closer. His eyes were moving across the page, focused, tracking the words. His voice didn't change. Tank 5 occupied. No admission record. Log card already filled. I didn't fill it. I reached out and touched his shoulder. He turned the page and kept reading. I left him there and walked toward the front of the building. The exterior door was still closed. I pushed it open and stepped out onto the gravel shelf. The fog had thickened. I could see maybe 10 feet before it turned solid gray. The dock was empty. Melvin was gone. I walked to the edge of the platform and looked down. The water was flat. No movement. No sound except the low hum of the dredging rigs somewhere out in the fog. The staging area where the third specimen had been left in the catch bin was clear. The bin was overturned on its side. Faint parallel marks ran across the concrete from the bin to the edge of the dock. Thin grooves like something had dragged itself across the surface. I stood at the exterior door of the building, the fog at 10 feet. The dock empty where Melvin had been standing minutes ago. I was alone outside. I walked toward the water. The gravel crunched under my boots, each step loud in the fog. I could see Doris ahead, just barely, standing at the edge where the shelf dropped off toward the black rock beach below. "Doris," I called out. She turned to face me. Her eyes were tracking. She was there, present. Not like Kenneth in the corridor, not like Melvin on the dock. She was herself. In her hand was one of the tank log cards, white paper in a clear plastic sleeve. I could see writing on it even from 10 feet away. I reached her and stopped. The water was directly below us, flat and black, the fog sitting on top of it like a lid. "What did you do?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She looked down at the card in her hand, then back at me. "I think whatever is operating in the water has been at this longer than the station has existed," she said. Her voice was steady, quiet. "I called them this morning on the emergency relay. I told them we were ready. They said they're coming to do inventory." I looked at the card. Tank 6. Today's date at the bottom, filled in with her handwriting. One word below it. Acclimated. I looked back at the water. There was movement. Not surface chop, not waves. Something underneath, slow and organized. Shapes, circular. Each one about the size of the specimens from the tanks. Multiple shapes, moving outward from the shore in a loose pattern, like they were spreading out after having been gathered close. I counted 4, then 5, then I stopped counting. Doris stood beside me, still holding the card. She didn't speak. I didn't speak. The shapes continued moving, sliding through the water without breaking the surface, their outlines visible only because the fog made the water just translucent enough to see them. They moved in different directions, each one following its own path, but all of them moving away from the station. One by one, the fog took them. The last circular shape slid past the edge of visibility and disappeared into the gray. The water went still, flat again, empty. Doris and I stood on the gravel shelf above the beach in silence. I woke on the processing floor with my face pressed against cold concrete. The headache came first, then the confusion about how I'd gotten there. Kenneth was standing over me with a cup of coffee in his hand, looking down at me with the same flat expression he always had. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just waited. I pushed myself up to sitting. My watch read 9:47 in the morning. The last thing I remembered clearly was standing on the gravel shelf with Doris, watching the shapes move through the water. "How long was I out?" I asked. Kenneth shrugged. "Found you here about 20 minutes ago," he said. "Thought you might want coffee." He held out the cup. I took it, my hands shaking slightly as I brought it to my lips. The coffee was lukewarm and tasted like it had been sitting for hours. Across the processing floor, Melvin was at the conveyor sorting a fresh catch, both hands moving steadily through the bins. No crackers, no radio clipped to his belt. He looked up once when I got to my feet, nodded, and went back to work. Everything looked normal. The smell of brine and refrigerant, the hum of the conveyor, the overhead lights casting their usual shadows across the equipment. But the holding section door was open. I walked toward it slowly, still holding the coffee cup. Kenneth didn't follow. He just stood where he was, watching me go. The door swung wider when I pushed it. The holding section was lit by the same overhead fluorescence as always. 6 tanks, numbered 1 through 6, lids open. All of them empty. I moved down the row, checking each one. The water was drained. The temperature gauges all read ambient. The log cards slotted into their brackets on the sides were blank. Not removed, just blank, as though nothing had ever been written on them. I pulled the card from tank 3 and held it up to the light. Clean white paper. No trace of ink. No indentations from a pen pressing through from previous entries. My hands were still shaking. I walked back out to the processing floor. Kenneth was leaning against the equipment cage now, his arms crossed. "What happened to the tanks?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "Holding section's been decommissioned for equipment maintenance," he said. "Past 2 weeks. You knew that." I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. His face showed nothing. No concern, no confusion, nothing. "Doris called in this morning," he continued. "Said she'll be on the island by Friday. Supply run got delayed." I stared at him. "Doris was here," I said. "On the beach. She was..." Kenneth shook his head. "Doris has been off-site since last Tuesday," he said, "coordinating with the dredging company about the automated program. You logged it yourself." My pulse was hammering in my ears. I looked over at Melvin, who was still sorting catch without looking up. His movements were smooth and practiced. Normal. I set the coffee cup down on the nearest workbench and pulled my phone from my pocket. 3 text messages to Sierra sent between midnight and 2 in the morning. The first one read, "I'm fine, work is good." The second, "Station's quiet, just routine maintenance." The third, "Everything's normal here. Don't worry." I didn't remember sending any of them. Below the third message was Sierra's reply. "Okay, good," was starting to worry. I scrolled up through the conversation. The last message I actually remembered sending was from my first week, telling her the place was remote and I'd have spotty signal. These 3 new messages were in my thread, with my number sent from my phone, but I had not written them. My hands were shaking harder now. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and walked toward the maintenance office. The door was unlocked. The office looked exactly as it always did. Metal desk, filing cabinet, the safe in the corner, the protocol binder sitting on the desk where it always sat. I pulled out the chair and sat down, opened the binder. 14 days of entries, written in my handwriting. I turned back to the first page. The date was from 2 weeks ago, the day after I'd arrived at Vanthorpe. The entries were formatted exactly the way Doris had shown me. Time, date, tank number, temperature reading, status notes. Every entry was in my hand. My loops on the Y's, my slant on the capital T, my abbreviation for temperature, temp, not the full word. I flipped forward. Each page was the same. Morning logs at 6 a.m., evening logs at 6 p.m., temperature readings for all 6 tanks, status updates, everything accurate, everything detailed, everything procedurally correct. Tank 3's temperature had spiked on day 4. I'd logged it. Temp plus 4 degrees, alarm triggered, supervisor notified. I remembered that. I remembered holding the lid down. Tank 6 had been assigned a new specimen on day 2. I'd logged it. Surface specimen admitted 1420, responsive, baseline temp achieved. I remembered that too. The thing flexing in the bin as we carried it. Page after page. My handwriting. My logs. 14 days of routine maintenance records, written as though nothing unusual had happened at all. But I didn't remember writing them. I turned to the last page. Today's date at the top, one final entry at the bottom. All units clear. Inventory complete. New intake expected Friday. The line below it was blank. I looked up at the top of the page, at the printed field labeled Responsible Party. My name was there. Dylan Harris. But it wasn't in my handwriting. It was in Declan's. The same tight, regular hand I'd seen on the first 4 log cards when Doris had walked me through the holding section on my very first day. The same hand I'd seen on the entries in his notebook, the ones Kenneth had shown me. I stared at the name for a long time. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed faintly. Somewhere on the processing floor, the conveyor hummed. Melvin's voice drifted through the open door, calling out weights and species to no one in particular. I looked back down at the page, at my name printed in someone else's hand, at the blank line below the final entry, waiting.